All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today's event. Today I'm joined by Dr. Christine Sarteschi, who is an expert in sovereign citizens and related movements. Today we're going to have a conversation about sovereign citizens and their ties to violent extremism in the United States. Without further ado, Dr. Christine Sarteschi is a full professor of social work and criminology at Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and she is also a fully licensed clinical social worker and serves as a victims advocate with the Cold Case Foundation. Her recent work examines the intersection of QAnon and the sovereign citizen movement and the social phenomenon of Romana Ditallo, a self-appointed QAnon cult figure who falsely believes she is the Queen and President of Canada. She has written and published and been featured in multiple uh, news outlets and academic journals. And without further ado, Dr. Sarteschi, did I miss anything?
No, you got it all. Thanks so much.
All right. With that, we will get started with our formal Q&A portion of today's event. Um, I kind of wanted to start today by asking you kind of how you got involved in this area of research. How did you first come into contact with the sovereign citizens movement, and what sort of inspired you to dedicate a large portion of your academic career to studying it?
I think I first came upon the group watching videos, seeing them on YouTube, and coming across them in different academic circles as well. But also, I was particularly interested in their behavior, particularly how they interact with police and how sure they are of what they're saying and their ideas, and how they repeatedly engage in similar type of behavior despite it never working. And so I was particularly interested in why they believe these ideas so strongly, and just don't seemingly respond to failure or negative effects. So that's pretty much how I got into it some 7, 8 years ago.
Hmm. And what were some of those answers you found to those why questions in your first, few years of studying it?
Well, in the beginning, there really wasn't a ton of research. So a lot of it was just exploring and trying to even be a part of and belong to some of their groups, and to, just kind of see what they were saying and how it evolved over time. And one of the things I learned about why it continues, it seems, is because there are just no shortage of ideas or new people in the movement. And so there's always a new idea, a new strategy, a new tactic that somebody could try, which I think gives hope to other people, who are trying to utilize these tactics. And so it's just an endless supply of ideas and new people coming in. And so there doesn't seem to be anything that stops that. And so if somebody does have a negative outcome, and maybe even say, I tried that A, B, or C, and it didn't work for me. They'll say, but yeah, you didn't do it the right way. You didn't do it this way, or you didn't try my new method. And so there's always new methods around the corner.
Got you. Um, with this revolving door, I guess, of new ideas and new people that come into the movement, is that primarily driven by success or failure in their efforts?
I mean, I think that some of what they experience in attempting to utilize these tactics may be misperceived as success. So if, for instance, someone gets into legal trouble and they provide or they submit a bunch of motions to the court, which the court will naturally reject, but if they got so much like paper terrorism, let's say, they will blanket the court with all these motions, and then a prosecutor drops the case, that to them seems like a win. And so that might be taken back to other people who are similar, who have similar ideas, or their friends in the movement, and say, hey, look, I submitted, the affidavit of truth and da 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 da, and they dropped my case. And so this method really works.
Yeah. Um, Broadly, how would you describe the sovereign citizens' belief system? What does it entail? What are their sort of central tenets, if they have any?
Right. So that's a great question. They are decentralized in the sense that they're kind of a loose group of people. So there aren't many sort of larger groups. But generally speaking, they believe that they do not essentially have to abide by the laws of the United States or whatever their respective countries. that there are ways around the laws. So if you file certain paperwork, if you quote unquote like break a contract or you don't agree to a contract with a public official of any kind, then you don't have to. It's essentially a loophole in the law that they found.
Hmm.
So, they have found in their view all these loopholes, which means that they can essentially, not have to get a driver's license, not have to register a car, not have to get insurance, all these things that basically allow them to skirt the law. So it's pick or choose a lot of the time. They will follow certain laws and not others. But by and large, it's that they have found some loophole and they don't agree or they don't consent to something and therefore they don't have to do it.
So with some of those loopholes, do you find any ties between sovereign citizen-esque sort of beliefs and like, I don't know, constitutional sheriffs or posse comitatus adjacent sort of groups or ideas?
Certainly, yes. I mean, with some of those groups, particularly, they have some of the basic elements of the
Hmm.
sovereign citizen ideology, in that they essentially can pick and choose which laws they will follow, based on some misperception of the law, they've misperceived it, or they've misinterpreted the law. So it's always on the basis of some misinterpretation, but their perception being correct. So there is some similarities, I think.
Yeah. So what does, sovereign exactly mean when they say they're a sovereign citizen? Are they not a United States citizen? Are they a citizen of their state or their county or their locality?
Well, I think it varies because I've seen people claim that they are citizens of their state, but
Hmm.
not of the United States. So they have a lot of terms and ways that they describe themselves. So, for instance, I've seen people describe themselves as an Ohioan, for instance, that they live in that state and they only abide by the laws of that particular state, but that they aren't a U.S. citizen. And some of them now have been attempting to acquire passports, which they believe makes them a non-citizen of the United States, which means to them they don't have to follow the laws of the United States. And extending on that, they also believe with that passport, which they are now giving over to police as identification, that they have a diplomatic status, which means that the police are not allowed to detain them, not allowed to arrest them, these certain things. So they have a special status, if you will.
Hmm. Um, so when they try and, come up with these like alternative identification forms, I did a little bit of research prior to, convening this event. And there seems to be this big idea of like all capital or lowercase letters on certain identification forms. So why do they do that?
I mean, to me, it's essentially another loophole that they have found that says that this is not the person they are. They are the person who's the lowercase letters. They're not the uppercase letters. It's a way to essentially get out of whatever contract or legal problem that they're involved in. So it's just another, in my view, variation of this isn't me. You can't charge me with this crime. I am only the lowercase version of this, and not the uppercase. And therefore, you sent me this form in all uppercase letters. I don't have to pay this bill or I don't have to do this.
Yeah. Um, so when when we're talking about the belief system in general, we have these sort of anti-authority, anti-government sort of ideas that come from the movement. But by and large, broad overview, where did this sort of start, and where did this sort of originate? I don't assume that there is a founding father of sovereign citizen movement. Rather, probably a few people here and there. But where do you see this sort of originating from?
It seems like the from the 1950s tax protester movement, and then so that was around the 50s, and then there were certain people who got into a lot of trouble for trying these very similar methods that we see today. It's amazing to me that even back then, the same methods that were being attempted and failed are still being attempted and failed today. But and then we saw in the 1970s, I think, and then over the course of time, just certain periods throughout history when there was, different financial issues in the country, 2008, um, real estate crisis, and things like that can, I think, enhance the number of people in the movement or increase the number of people in the movement. Um, but generally, tracing it back to the 1950s, it seems like.
Yeah, so you mentioned, the 2008 financial crisis and, other flashpoints in American history. Do you kind of see that as a primary driver of how people get sucked into the movement and start to adopt some of these ideas, or is there something else?
I mean, I think that is a possibility. I don't think that we've researched it enough to know for sure why people enter the movement. There isn't just really a lot of research on that in general. I do think that a large part of it is social media. I mean, I think that, and that's been around a while, of course, but it just, if you compare social media and the internet today, and thinking back to before the internet and how difficult it was to get your message out in general. Now it is so easy to spread the message, your ideas. You can have, a website up in 2 minutes, and all of a sudden you have your, broadcasting your ideas to the world. And so I think with social media and the internet, that has been, to me, the biggest facilitator of this movement. We see it in other countries. We see people in other countries influenced by the Americans in this particular movement. So to me, broadly speaking, that is a big spreader of this movement.
Yeah, so you mentioned social media, and I kind of want to take this in a couple different directions. The first is, so prior to, social media and the internet, how did these sovereign citizens, the early sovereign citizens, I guess, sort of spread their message? Do they have like seminars, tours, pamphlets? What did they use?
I mean, I think putting advertisements and magazines and different outlets like that, there definitely were seminars that people attended, but there really wasn't, and maybe radio as well. Um,
Hmm.
but that's pretty much it. We still see people having seminars today, of course, but maybe not to the degree as it was then.
Yeah. So what does that sort of media ecosystem look like today? Um, with obviously social media and everything, but what other avenues do they happen to use?
I do think that people are holding seminars, but they are advertising them on social media. I mean,
Hmm.
the area that I focus on the most is social media and different um, platforms and how people orient themselves with each other on those platforms. So it's mostly social media that I see and study and focus on.
So are they utilizing some of like the alternative platforms like Rumble or Gab or Odyssey as opposed to like X or Facebook? Because it kind of strikes me as, being a sovereign citizen and isn't exactly something that would get you kicked from Facebook or X or anything like that. So is
Yeah.
it mainstream platforms, alternative? What's kind of the split here, if you can give one?
I've seen X. There's even sovereign citizens who advertise on X, which has been brought
Hmm.
to my attention, which I thought was interesting. Facebook, I see quite a few Facebook. I do see Telegram, Rumble, of
Oh,
course,
okay.
those sites. But there is no shortage of sovereigns on mainstream TikTok platforms. I've seen, YouTube. I think YouTube will sometimes, depending on the nature of what is posted, I've heard certain sovereign citizens complain about their material being taken down, but not always. There's
Hmm.
a lot of it up there. So it's both really.
So is the content that usually gets removed from YouTube like interactions with police, or does it kind of ride that border between violence or non-violence or hate speech or however you kind of want to classify that?
I've seen people post videos on things like negotiable instruments, which is a certain tactic that don't know all the ins and outs of, but sovereign citizens attempt negotiable instrument type of tactics. And sometimes they will post videos where they're attempting to teach people the tactics. And I've seen them get those taken down. And I know on YouTube, when a video is posted that seemingly has sovereign citizen type of ideology, I don't know how this is done exactly, but they will have a notice on right underneath the video that the sovereign citizen movement that links to Wikipedia that sort of
Hmm.
alerts the person or the viewer that they might be watching a sovereign citizen video.
Mm. Okay. So have you seen social media platforms take any sort of action other than YouTube, like X or Facebook, take any sort of moderation actions against these folks or groups?
I've seen anecdotally people complain in some of the groups that I follow that sometimes TikTok will take down their materials. It's not clear because they don't always say what the material was, so it's hard to know like
Hmm.
why that video over another one. So I've seen TikTok complaints about that, and I have seen certain gurus get banned from even X on occasion. So it could be
Yeah.
that posting some of them are selling products, and it could be that that's part of why they get taken down. Maybe they appear to be selling, dubious products. It could be that as well. So it's not clear, but I have seen certain platforms, take down some of their materials.
Yeah. So let's talk about the sort of grift that briefly alluded to, selling products. So is it like Alex Jones supplements sort of products? Are they shilling, like gold or freeze-dried food? Or what is that they do to sort of make money from this?
I do see some of them selling. There is one particular. He's not a sovereign citizen guru, I wouldn't call him, but he's kind of a straddles between sovereign citizen, anti-vax type of person, and he sells products kind of like Alex Jones does, and he gets, I think,
Hmm.
a lot of platforms, but mostly people are selling paperwork to different techniques that download or fill out these forms, and you can be free from having to pay the IRS or those kinds of things. So there are forms, sometimes there's products like merchandise, t-shirts, things of that nature. But there's always like a product that people are selling, something to download, something to fill out, that type of stuff.
Do those, profits and revenue from, those sales, do they go to, line the person's pockets, or do they, sort of end up reinvested in the business to, gain a further reach?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. It's really hard to tell. They charge quite a bit of money. I think the other place that they charge is when they do seminars. Um,
Hmm.
Seminars, they charge depending on how long the seminar is. It could be anywhere from 150 to $300 per event. But it's hard to know where that money goes. For some of them, this is seemingly all they do. So to me, it seems like an income source for them. I don't know
Hmm.
for sure, but it's sort of become their job, if you will. And so to me, it seems like it's something that's supporting them and their well-being or their livelihood, as opposed to furthering the movement. So it's hard to tell for sure.
Yeah. So we'll get to the Queen of Canada in a minute here. But outside of her, are there any other sort of like big figureheads or, louder voices or influencers in the community that you think that people should be aware of?
Well, there was, I would say, up until recently, a group who calls themselves American State Nationals, and they were a more organized group, in the sense that they had a pretty big following on Telegram. So at one point, they were up to like about 43,000, at least members in the Telegram group.
Yeah.
Um, and they were run by David Straight and Bobby Lawrence, but Mr. Straight recently passed away, and they had a falling out, and so that group has fractured a bit. I would say more recently. There's Anna von Reitz, who's been around a long time. She's a sovereign citizen guru who has been in trouble lately with the IRS. She owes them about $1.2 million. And interestingly, on Telegram and different other platforms, she has started organizing in other countries. So she has a group who follow her in Canada. And it appears to be they have offshoots in Australia and South Africa, and they're pretty organized, I would
Hmm.
say. And then there's another individual by the name of Brandon Joe Williams. He's been sort of an up and coming, I would say, sovereign citizen guru. And he's amassing quite a big following in the United States. So there's a few of them out there.
Yeah. Um, so sort of, I kind of noticed that there is, a bit of influence, like you said, outside of the US on other countries like Canada, Australia, and I've even seen some in the UK even. Um, so what is it about, you know, the US sovereign citizen movement that appeals to others outside of America?
That's a great question. I think the appeal in general of sovereign citizen ideology is this idea that you get to do what you want. I mean, it is a self-serving philosophy in that way, because if you believe and you follow all these specific tactics, then you don't have to do any of the things that other people have to do. You don't have to pay your taxes, you don't have to get your car registered, and the list goes on. So it's appealing in that way. And I think that there are probably people in, you know, in all sorts of countries that we may not know about who are attracted to this way of thinking, the mentality. Because I've always referred to it as sort of an outlaw mentality. I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. I get to decide what I want to do, but that's not really how the laws of this country or any country work. So I just think that that mentality does appeal to a certain segment of any population, it seems like. So it's hard to know what is it about the United States that makes it appeal in other countries. But I think it's just that the internet makes it easy to learn about, and the Americans have had tactics for years, and all this downloadable material that's just out there, and it makes it easy to spread because it's already there.
Yeah. Um, so let's talk about the supposed Queen of Canada. Romana Didelot, is that how you say her last name?
Yes.
All right. So I first heard about her on another podcast called Q Not Anonymous. They sort of had this long-running sort of update series on her, but it's been a while since I've taken a look at it. Um, so who is the unofficial Queen of Canada?
Yeah, so as you said, Romana Didelot is her name. She's been around in this capacity, if you will, as naming herself the queen since about 2020. I think
Hmm.
she really became bigger during COVID because there was a lot of masking requirements that people didn't like, and I think people may have been attracted to her ideas about not masking, anti-mandate kind of stuff, or masks type of stuff. Anyway, so she lives in Canada, and currently she's in a abandoned school in Richmond, Saskatchewan, which is a very small town with only hundreds of people. And she's currently living there right now with anywhere between 5 to 10 people. It's really hard to say because they're extremely secretive. Prior to living in the abandoned school, she had been driving around the country in an RV, but right now those RVs are parked, and they are just spending their time gardening, it looks like,
Hmm.
in the school.
Um, so I believe she is from the Philippines. Yes.
Yes, yes. So
Yeah.
she came to Canada, I think it was British Columbia. I don't remember the year, but she's been here quite a long time, or in Canada quite a long time.
Hmm. So how did she first get involved with, the sovereign citizen or anti-government sort of milieu?
That's a great question. She, best we can tell, there's a lot about her we don't know. So she started a website. She had a couple of different websites. It looks like to be maybe 2019-ish, 2020. And she was just really upset about politicians. She doesn't like politics. In fact, one of her taglines is, no politics, something along those lines. So she started putting up materials on the web, just really targeting certain politicians or policies she didn't like in Canada. It's not clear how it evolved into what it did, but eventually she started adopting QAnon ideas. So I would say that primarily I thought of her as a QAnon figure. Sort of
Hmm.
really, she adopted a lot of those ideas. I'd say she's evolved into something where she has QAnon ideas, anti-vax, and she has, as part of her ideology, adopted some sovereign citizen ideas, particularly ideas about you have to consent to certain things in order to, agree to them, or, be prosecuted for something along those lines. And then she also believes in a lot of new age ideas. So, for instance, that she is an alien from another planet and she has special powers. She can levitate. She can visit people in their dreams. So she's a lot of really unusual ideas as well. So she's this person who believes in a lot of different things. Um, and that's kind of how she's evolved.
So, would you kind of, you know, you may be a little hesitant to, use the cult word, but do you think she's kind of crossing into that cult figure leadership sort of position?
I do. I thought for a long time, when she was on the road, one of the things that they did when they were out traveling is they would hold live events and they would invite people. They'd go to like a Walmart parking lot and hold a live event and invite people. And they'd sometimes get up, 20, 30 people. And so I remember I watched all those. I would watch them live and kind of report and watch and observe. One time she had about 10 or so people who lived on her RV with her. And there was one day where they spent talking about many hours about why they dedicated their lives to her and what she meant to them. And what was so interesting about it is how sincere they were, how dedicated they were, but they were all wearing uniforms, which I thought was particularly interesting, like white uniforms. They had a white hat, they had a white shirt, and they talked about how important that uniform was to them, all the chores they had to do. And so to me, at that point, I thought this seems more like a cult than anything else. So from that point on, I would feel comfortable using that term. Um,
Hmm.
and more recently, I would say the people who are left believing, let's just say the people who are left now, the believers, and there aren't nearly as many during her than during her peak at around 2021. They are true believers in that they think that she is everything to them. They're sending her money. They're not paying their own bills. They're getting their light shut off and they're sending her money. So it's almost like she can do no wrong, and they attribute things to her that she doesn't deserve credit for. She takes credit for, passing laws in Canada that she didn't pass, but they say that she did it. They give her credit. And so I think the way they talk about her and their devotion to her does make it seem like a bit of a cult.
Yeah. Um, so what is her, rationale for declaring herself the Queen of Canada? Canada is within the Commonwealth system of the United Kingdom, so, ultimately they sort of have to answer to, the crown and everything. But how does she see herself usurping that sort of system?
Well, she has a whole story she tells about how there were people in underground tunnels invading Canada, uh, the Communist Chinese Party, and that
Hmm.
she herself and she alone actually removed them from Canada. And so she talks about she I remember one time where she went into detail about this experience she had with removing them from these underground tunnels, and she talked about how emotional she was. She was very upset and moved by it. So because she saved Canada from this group single-handedly, she deserved the title that she gave herself. Now, when you say that she is a self-appointed queen, she gets very upset. She claims that someone else gave her this title. But that story changes about who that was over time. It's not a consistent story. So in her mind, it was all this work that she did to earn that title, when in reality, we know that she gave herself that title.
Yeah. I mean, with kings, queens, anybody in the sort of aristocracy, their authority comes from divinity, comes from God or whatever sort of higher power. Did she ever mention anything like that?
She doesn't mention God and like that term, but there is a higher power that they refer to. In fact, in their photographs, they will oftentimes point upwards, and that is a reference to what they call God, Master, Creator. So that's their
Hmm.
version of God. So in that,
Okay.
they're kind of religious, but they aren't. Even though she actually hates religion, she will reference God, Master, Creator as being important to her.
Yeah, I think that brings up another question I have. So, is there any sort of, primary religious bend or affiliation to sovereign citizens in general, or do they sort of exhibit a range of religious beliefs?
I do think it's a range. I do think they're just Christian primarily. I mean, that's if you see some of their postings, I think that would be the case. But I don't, I mean, they will reference like God's law and things like that in some of their materials. It's not uncommon for there to be a long list of biblical references in court motions. So
Hmm.
that's when I think of religion or religious elements in sovereigns. That's what I think of.
Yeah. Um, so with your, primary background, as I understand it, as, a social worker, so a mental health care professional, how does that sort of intersect with sovereign citizens and your research? You said that there's, usually some inquiry about mental health and sovereign citizens. What have your findings sort of been, if you've come across any?
Oh yeah, so the research in this area is very limited, but what we do know is that when I'll say it this way, when because they're involved in the law and legal the criminal justice system a lot, it's not uncommon for judges to request when someone were to come into a courtroom and say, prove your jurisdiction, show me your oath of office, and start saying these things to judges start to worry that there's a mental health issue here, especially when a judge will ask them questions about, do you understand the nature of your case? And they will say, I do not understand. But that's actually part of sovereign citizen ideology. What they
Hmm.
find in the limited studies that are available is that when sovereigns are sent to undergo a psychological competency evaluation, they're almost always found to be competent. So um, there is no diagnosable mental health condition for sovereign citizen ideology. So it's considered more of a way of thinking. Some have described it even as a political belief, but it is not
Hmm.
a mental illness. And I think the thing that people ask me the most is these people have to be mentally ill because they are repeatedly doing things that are not in their best interest. They're doing things that never work, so they must be mentally ill. And that's not what the research would suggest, that this is not a mental illness. I think it could be something we don't fully understand yet. But in terms of a diagnosable condition, there is no diagnosable condition. This is not to say that there aren't cases when a sovereign citizen also has a mental illness. That does happen. But
Hmm.
because someone believes in sovereign citizen ideology, that by in and of itself is not a sign of mental illness.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to find that in the newest edition of, the DSM or anything like that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Um, so what, you've repeatedly sort of pointed out that there is a limited, um, scope of research on the topic. Um, so why do you think that is?
I don't know, actually. I don't know. Maybe they're not a big enough group to study. I think that, maybe they're because they are like a loose group of people. A lot of the sovereign citizens, like they have their own individual ideas about, what they believe. And so they're not a big group. I also think that maybe we don't fully understand all of what there is to know about sovereigns. Like, so for instance, I read a lot of court records and I come up with new cases, seemingly on a daily basis. Like, there's a lot we don't know. So I'm not sure why there's a limited area of research, but there does seem to be.
And where do you think, the current swath of research could improve on? What are some, not necessarily shortcomings, but where do you think are some things that should be addressed with, future research?
I think how people get involved in the movement would be really good to know. Like, how does somebody, I mean, I have ideas and I see people entering groups and asking questions, but more systematic research about why someone would turn to this movement or choose these ideas. And also, when somebody leaves the movement, what made them leave? Why did they decide that this is no longer
Mm,
for them? That would be really good to know. Something more systematic research wise in that area would be good.
yeah. Um, I had an event with Dr. John Horgan a couple months ago, and we talked about, terrorist psychology, and I wouldn't necessarily classify sovereign citizens as like a terrorist movement, as far as I consider it. Others may disagree, um, but in that talk, we spoke about disengagement and sort of de-radicalization as two separate concepts. Um, do you think other areas of research when it comes to, psychology and terrorism, sort of the intersection of that, do you think those could be applied to, future research on sovereign citizens, even if it's not, broadly considered a terrorist sort of ideology?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to learn. I think there's a lot we don't know about this group. I'm finding myself, I get asked a lot of questions and I just don't have the research to turn to. I mean, I try to do as much as I humanly can, but I'm just one person. Um,
Yeah.
but I do think that there's a lot we could learn, especially I think around the psychology of the movement and what the attraction is. I think so for sure.
So what are some of, your inclinations? What are some of your theories on why people end up, being attracted to it or getting sucked into it? Is there any sort of, without, any sort of formal field work or interview process, is there something that you notice that a lot of these people have in common or exhibit?
I think that I don't think I think there's a number of reasons why, and I think people come into it for different reasons. I do think there's probably always been a group of people who don't want to be told what to do, and I think that the sovereign citizen ideology appeals to that group. They don't want anyone to tell them what they do. They want to do what they want to do, and I think that that outlaw, that's what I call an outlaw mentality, has always been around. But I also think that people come into it maybe because they get into legal trouble and
Hmm.
they might not have the money to afford an attorney. They may not understand the criminal justice system. They might think that it's easy to represent yourself, whatever the case may be. Um, or I do think that maybe someone gets their license suspended and they have to go to work, and so they need to drive. And so maybe if they get into trouble, they figure, hey, I could just give this paperwork to the cop if I get pulled over. This says I don't need the license anymore. So I think that there are people like that. And I see people post messages on Telegram, for instance, said, my son got into a lot of trouble. I'm only part of the way complete filling out my paperwork. Can you help me deal with this legal issue? Do you have tactics I could use for my son? Something along those lines. So I think that there's a multiple reasons why people, are attracted to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that sort of ends, the list of, actual questions that I have for you. So with that, I want to turn it over to our audience for our Q&A portion of it. So our first question is there a nexus between the sovereign citizen movement and other extremist groups or ideologies, such as affiliation with the Proud Boys, Patriot Front, any of the sort of quote unquote mainstream sort of groups that we see?
I have been studying lately some of the January 6th defendants and trying to identify how many of them were sovereign citizens and seeing a bit of overlap there. There
Hmm.
were cases where somebody was a Proud Boy and had tried sovereign citizen ideology in court.
Hmm.
So I did see some of that, but that's the one that comes to mind the most.
Yeah. I don't know. Did you look at any overlap between sovereign citizen, sort of ideology and like militia movements or militia groups or anything like that?
There are some that belong to militias,
Hmm.
that are also sovereign citizens. I did see that. I also saw some overlap with QAnon. I think that's another one I've been seeing more, especially cases where um, mothers in particular are involved in the child protective system. So they have their kids removed by deep child protective services. And then
Hmm.
there is a belief that a common belief I see are that child protective services is a front for a child trafficking organization. And so I see a lot of that overlap as well.
Okay. And then another question that we have is many in law enforcement associate the sovereigns as violent, but of course, there are plenty of non-violent sovereign citizens. So using violence assessment protocols and monitoring intelligence is likely used, but are there any particular groups that stand out as violent to you?
Um, Not groups. There was a group, there aren't many groups, sovereign citizen groups, I would say, um, because they're just a loosely affiliated group, sort of lot of people, if you will. But there
Hmm.
was a group called the PBI, the People's Bureau of Investigation. It was a group who were sovereign citizen in nature, who were focused on environmental problems. And they were sending very threatening letters and death threats to public officials. And then there were a couple who got arrested and they had some, like a lot of weaponry and things of that nature. So that group comes to mind in general.
Are there any, sort of other violent interactions that sovereign citizens have had that sort of stand out?
Yeah, so I think the group that obviously interacts with them the most and they'll probably see the most violence is police because they're the
Hmm.
ones pulling them over. But I do think that I've actually been collecting different cases of violence over the last 7, 8 years. And so I'm trying to understand myself at what point are they violent. But I think that people who interact with them, so it could be people at like notaries sometimes notaries will not, or court recorders or excuse me, county recorders, people who are where sovereigns are going to file their paperwork. Sometimes the county recorder will not file that paperwork, and that really upsets sovereigns, and then they sue them. So sometimes I've seen some violence there in those cases. So it's really hard to know for sure. I think, like I mentioned before, I think people who are involved in child protective services need to be aware of this ideology because they're the ones that might get threats, people threatening them. People are really obviously upset about losing their kids. But I think sovereigns sometimes have let's say, potentially a mentality that says, I'm willing to do anything for my children. I'm willing to harm this person if I need to. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah. Another one that we have is how are sovereign citizens in general or within certain subgroups instructed to interact with police? What are some common tactics that they're taught to use if they're talking to the police?
They will say, who I let's say there is no crime here. I need your supervisor here. There's paperwork that they are sometimes have in their vehicles that they will give the police. One tactic I've seen is that they will tell each other to go to the police chief in their town and instruct them and educate them about their ideology so that when they get pulled over, they can say, hey, I already talked to Chief so and so, and he said this is it.
Hmm.
So that's another tactic I've seen.
Yeah. Um, Another question that we have is, can you talk about symbolism in the movement, such as the well of the court or flag toppers, etc.?
Yeah, that seems to be for some meaningful. I know that there's the gold fringe on the flag.
Yeah.
It's sometimes hard to keep track of what it means to them because there's so many. new people in the movement and then new ideas become symbolic to them and have a specific meaning. So I, for a long time, tried to follow the logic, and I found myself like feeling overwhelmed because there was so much logic, if you will, or rationalization somebody had about a symbol. But yeah, I would say generally symbols are important.
So where does the notion that a non-citizen can't be arrested come from? Do they think that someone from France can commit crimes in the US or an American can commit crimes in France, for instance?
I think that they are focused, at least currently, on diplomatic immunity, and
Hmm.
that there's certain things that, the idea is like I fill out this paperwork and I no longer have to follow the laws. I mean, that's all I can think of. But I think that they also think that there's a certain immunity they have to the things that everyone else has to do that they don't have to do because they know about this paperwork and they've done the correct methodology to get out of it. So it's some secret idea that they've found out, a loophole they've figured out. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
Yeah. Do you see any escalation specific indicators from the social work front that takes someone from, paper terrorism to escalating towards violence?
that's a really good question. I think that's an area that we need to study more, sort of the path to violence. So we don't really know exactly, but I think that true believers, people who really believe in the movement. I'm thinking about cases like Neely Petrick Blanchard, who had her children taken away,
Mm,
became involved with sort of went to somebody and said, "Can you help me get my kids back?" And he kept promising he could get her kids back with sovereign citizen tactics. And then
yeah,
he didn't. It also, at some point, she started to believe that he was part of some other secret group. And so she ended up shooting him. So it was
yeah,
that he kept promising it never happened, potentially her being paranoid as well.
yeah.
So
I remember that being sort of a QAnon adjacent case almost.
right. Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
It was sort of a mix between she was utilizing a sovereign citizen guru to help her get her kids back, but part of that was that she thought that the Child Protective Services workers were hurting her kids by, involving them in child sex trafficking.
yeah. So sort of on the legal aspect of it, there's a question that asks, are there any instances of any aspect of sovereign citizen defense being effective in court? I've seen lots of patient judges and lots of foolish defendants, but never any arguments or stances that work.
I'm not aware of any case that has actually worked on the basis of sovereign citizen ideology or tactics. I've actually seen judges in court motions that will repeat what they're calling precedent, which is the idea that these tactics have never worked in a court of law, not in the United States. And I've seen other judges in other countries make the same statement. So I think that people might win on a legal technicality, but never on the basis of a sovereign citizen argument.
Mm, okay. So we have a question that asks, I'm intrigued by what you think the split between true believers and grifters is. Von Reitz, for example, appears to be a simple grifter, while Didelot seems to be a true believer who happens to grift.
Yeah, I mean, I think without being able to interview people in depth, it's hard to know who is who. I mean, I do think that there is benefit I think there's both a potentially financial benefit to being a true believer, but we also know that many of the gurus make money in the process, so it's hard to know. And I do think there's also a psychological component to it that being a guru, if you will, is giving someone the feeling of importance and being very special. So it's hard to disentangle those things without being able to do more in-depth research, I think, into why somebody came into the movement and what it means for them to be that guru at the time.
Yeah. We have a related question, semi to your last answer. Do sovereign citizens find their primary identity in being a sovereign citizen, either initially upon getting involved in the movement or later on?
That's a great question. I think that it's hard to know for sure without more research, I would say, but I do think that there are some that it does seem to be their true identity. And I think they're the ones who are more involved in the movement, maybe even, providing seminars, going to seminars even. So I think there's people at different stages in seeing this as part of their identity. I think there are some people who try it and give it up pretty quickly because it didn't work and they don't want the problems and the headache that comes along with it. But there certainly are people who are willing to do anything and will continue trying it even when it never works. So I do think we need more research to figure out who those people are, but I do see a range.
Yeah. Let's see. Could you explain some of the more common paper terrorism tactics sovereign citizens use in courts or against law enforcement?
I think the most common one are liens, and
Hmm.
states don't have great laws about filing liens. Some of them do. Some of them, like Florida, has really strict laws about that. But even in states where there are laws about liens, they don't necessarily cover like everyday people. They might just cover public officials. So I think it's liens. And then they just love to oftentimes blanket the court with just I've seen it. I saw a case recently. It was actually a January 6th defendant and that, situation sort of adjudicated, who was filing motions that were over 1,000 pages long. And it was just a bunch of cut and pasted, like old paperwork or even parts of a book, things like that. So I think that is the type of thing we see more than anything, the liens and just a flood of paperwork.
So do you think COVID-19 restrictions and mandates revitalized the movement? Um, and this person also asks if you're familiar with Thomas Deegan, from West Virginia.
I have heard the name. Yes, I do think that it did at least assist, if not revitalize, it did bring more people into the movement, potentially because people who were against mandates or anti-masking requirements, I think more or less could found that there were some of these tactics and paperwork online that they could download. And then give to their employer or give to whomever to say, I don't have to follow this rule, this law, that type of thing.
Yeah. Uh, let's see here. We've got a lot of good questions here. Um, so what strategies or training approaches have proven effective for law enforcement dealing with sovereign citizen encounters?
I think it seems like I know there were people from the ADL in particular who've done a ton of training, the Southern Poverty Law Center who've done training for police, just teaching them about how do you know when you're dealing with a sovereign citizen, what are the keywords and phrases, how to diffuse a situation because it can quickly escalate during a traffic stop, that you shouldn't argue with people on the road, because I think that the more you argue, if you watch any of the sovereign citizen videos, they always have a reply. And so it is a fruitless effort to try and argue. So those are some of the tactics I think that have assisted in police knowing when they're dealing with the sovereign and then kind of shutting it down quickly or calling for backup.
Okay. On a related note, so what do practitioners in law enforcement or the legal field need to understand the most when encountering, sovereign citizen legal arguments?
I think that the most important thing is to know that these are not people who don't know any better and that they're not like miseducated about the law. I mean, they are in the sense that they're wrong about their interpretation. But sometimes I think people think, hey, I can just educate them about why they're wrong, and now they'll stop doing what they're doing. But that does not seem to be the case because actually sometimes they know the law better than the other people they're talking to, better than, the legal professionals in the sense that they've memorized it, they've argued this before. So it isn't about necessarily, I think, trying to educate them. It's really not engaging in that argument to begin with, and potentially doing a better job of gatekeeping those people out of the court system to begin with.
Yeah. Um, so how do you see the sovereign citizen movement evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? Are there any emerging trends that are worth watching?
I I think that the emerging trend I see is that it continues unabated, and that I have not seen anything necessarily that has stopped the movement. And I think that in without any intervention, it will just continue. I did see recently in Germany, they did ban a particular sovereign citizen slash QAnon group.
Yeah.
Uh, and interestingly, they made it illegal essentially, and they blocked all their social media. And I think that, that is going to stop this movement in its tracks potentially. I'm not suggesting we ban them necessarily, but I do think that we don't take any action, it seems like, as a group. And I think that, or as a country, and I think that's partly because people see them as sort of small potatoes, not that big of a deal. We don't hear about them that often. And so for many people, that's just not on their radar.
Yeah. Um, has any sovereign citizen ever been like, elected to some sort of office or anything like county, state, or anything like that that you're aware of?
There were a few maybe state legislators who had potentially adopted a little bit of the ideology, but nothing major that I can think of.
Okay. Um, so now that we see sovereign citizens facing significant consequences, legal consequences at least, loss of a house, a job, etc. How does the movement respond to or understand these outcomes? Is there anything different than just like trying something new, or is that the primary mode?
I mean, it seems to be the primary mode. I do think we need more research in that area because we don't necessarily know what happens to people sort of after they get in trouble. Like sometimes
Hmm.
just having studied cases, I will see that people have like a long history of trying to intervene, trying sovereign citizen methods. But we don't know like when somebody gives up or tries something else or gives it up altogether. We just don't really know or have those answers right now.
Okay. We got time for one more question before we sign off for the day. Um, are we seeing any alliances forming between American and Australian sovereign citizens?
Um, I anecdotally, I see some groups, like I mentioned before, Anna von Reitz now who's an American sort of sovereign citizen guru, has a group in Canada and Australia and different countries. Um, and we know that Australia is seeing more sovereign citizens in their legal system. I don't know the extent to which they're influenced by Americans.
Hmm.
But there definitely does seem to be some connection. I just don't know that we fully understand how that has happened.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. So with that, for the sake of time and brevity, we will end our Q&A portion with our audience. I would like to thank everybody for coming today and taking time out of your day to attend this important discussion with Dr. Sarteschi. Um, is there anything else that you'd like the audience to, sort of keep in mind before we go?
No, I mean, I thank you for your great questions. They were really good.
Yeah, excellent. So where can the audience find some of your work?
I think it's available on different journals sites, excuse me, journal article sites. There's some open source stuff. If you just Google my name, you should be able to find some of it there.
Great. And with that, we will let you go for the day. Again, thank you to everybody who came, and thank you to Dr. Sarteschi. If you happen to miss some portion of this event, this is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel later. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.